Today, why does every country seem to struggle with some of the most dire economic crises ever seen in history? And why is this happening more often in today's world than ever before? Out of the countries that are on the brink of collapse, Sri Lanka is a country we have been seeing in the news more often these days. What is actually happening in Sri Lanka at this very moment? And what critical situation is its economy in? Today, we are going to let you have a look at what's happening to Sri Lanka's economy and what it was like before this period. Let's get started from the very beginning, the point where all the problems lie that has taken Sri Lanka to this delicate situation. Sri Lanka was once ruled by the British Empire and was known as Ceylon at that time. The British ruled Sri Lanka for about 150 years. In 1948, it received its independence. At that time, Sri Lanka was comparatively more developed than many of its neighboring countries. It had not gone through the suffering of World War II. None of its infrastructures were destroyed during the times other developed countries were experiencing the havoc of the war. Its education, health, politics, and standards of living were exemplary models for adjacent countries. Its economy was booming due to the export trade that the British Empire had earlier instituted. Its economic stability can be estimated by comparing its GNP of 1950 to other nations. Sri Lanka's GNP at that time was 11.4%, while Pakistan's GNP was 9%. India's was 7.1%, and Thailand's GNP was 9.6%. Sri Lanka achieved so much due to the continuing progress and development the British Empire had initiated on the island. The biggest challenge was to strengthen the country's agricultural industry and increase exports of crops and agricultural products. But then something grave hit Sri Lanka's growing economy that had been raising its head since the country was given its independence. In 1948, when the country's constitution was being drafted, only the elite and ruling class were in contact with the British administrators. In this way, the country's minorities were greatly ignored, and the country's constitution categorically didn't include them. This created division in a recently independent country that would continue on for generations. The newly elected government tried to dissolve this disparity by offering subsidies on those foods that were the staple diet for the minorities. This was done to create an air of cooperation. However, the government was paying huge sums of money for these subsidies. The costs for those subsidies were paid by generating revenues during World War II and the Korean War. But when these wars ended, Sri Lanka could no longer pay for the subsidies. Thus, prices of food and products had to be raised. Sri Lanka also imposed restrictions on imports so as to develop industries inside the country. However, various monopolists and cartels took control of these industries. Those restrictions didn't bring fruit to the country, since Sri Lanka could not produce every product itself efficiently. The reason is the cost of production was high, which made production more expensive than importing the product itself. The close alliance between monopolists and government administrators led to corruption, keeping the citizens on the margins. This could be seen in the standard of living of the everyday Sri Lankan citizen. In 1960, Sri Lanka's per capita income was $140. By 1977, 17 years later, the per capita income had reached only $200. Neighboring countries like Thailand had a per capita income of $420, South Korea $820, and Malaysia $930. The Sri Lankan government had banned imports and nationalized industries, resulting in losing foreign investments. But after 1977, the government started to seek the free market and establish ties with neighboring countries for economic stability. This effort paid off, and Sri Lanka received benefits. However, the Sri Lankan government's negative attitude and oppression directed toward several minority groups resulted in a civil war inside the country that continued until 1994, when the government changed. The newly elected government focused more on the country's production, especially on textiles and finished products. This brought positive impacts for the country as a whole, and Sri Lanka's products were creating great competition in the open global market. This was the time when Sri Lanka started reviving its economy by gradually solving unresolved issues. Its stock market boomed while the per capita income increased from $994 in 2004 to $3,274 in 2013. Inflation also decreased and was reduced to 3.17% in 2013 from 22.5% in 2008. However, all these facts and figures only superficially show that the country's economy was improving. In reality, this progress was unsustainable as the major developments were due to the debts the country had taken on. Thus, the economic progress of each individual had cost the country's economy much that would eventually have to be repaid. Even though the development was fueled by debts, the project seemed ambitious and promising. For example, the construction of an entirely new city named the City of the Future at the Colombo port city is something to consider. This project has been backed up by China's Belt and Road Initiative and has a cost of $15 billion. And this is where things get tricky. Due to the corrupt politicians and leadership that Sri Lanka has inherited, projects like these are victims of corruption. There are signs that billions of dollars worth of contracts have been completed without any records and are trapping the country into debt. Government, on the other hand, seems to focus more on internal issues like producing more food and products for the growing population. Instead of producing export-quality products like textiles, electronics, and finished products, Sri Lanka is paying an opportunity cost in the form of economic instability and crisis. Since Sri Lanka shifted its paradigm from being a manufacturing country to a debt-funded economic runner, it lost the cushion to deal with any unexpected shocks. And the shock came with the pandemic, when every country in the world suffered and countries like Sri Lanka came to the brink of collapse. Even though Sri Lanka was not a big exporter, its economy depended directly on exports. Due to the pandemic, Sri Lanka's exports to other countries declined, which hit its delicate economy hard. The export revenue was expected to be $18.5 billion, while only $11 billion was generated. Sri Lanka also relied greatly on the remittance sent by its workers working in foreign countries. With the pandemic, a sharp decline in remittance was witnessed that further shocked the struggling Sri Lankan economy. Tourism is Sri Lanka's third biggest revenue generator, coming after exports and remittances. Due to the attacks in the country on hotels, suicide bombings, and political instability, the tourism industry suffered, and this has had a direct negative impact on the economy. In 2018, about 2.5 million tourists visited Sri Lanka, offering about $5.6 billion to its economy. 2020 saw only 500,000 tourists come to Sri Lanka, with a resulting 80% reduction in generated revenue. Also, Sri Lanka's currency witnessed a great plunge against the United States dollar due to the excess currency production, leading to inflation. This left Sri Lanka with only one industry to rely on: agriculture. However, due to the decline in exports, Sri Lanka had no other option than to export the agricultural products and fertilizers that its own farmers needed. This increased prices of fertilizers in the country, which is why the current Sri Lankan president encouraged farmers to shift to organic farming and use the ancient techniques. This, in turn, was hailed as a big achievement undertaken by Sri Lanka on various international forums. However, this brought havoc to the agricultural industry, resulting in low crop production, adding more unbearable weight to the ebbing Sri Lankan economy. This is the reason why we are seeing such an economic crisis in Sri Lanka. However, something needs to be clarified here. Every country has gone through a pandemic and has faced economic challenges. Talking about Sri Lanka specifically, the country has been struggling since its independence, and the pandemic tested all its means. Thus, it brought its economy to the lowest position it had ever been in.